Good morning. Welcome. It's a beautiful day. It's not 37 degrees below zero, and we don't have snow. So anything like that in February in Indiana is awesome. My name's Steve Dunlop, and I'm the managing director for the center, which means that I get to work with the center, the students, and the companies, and it just makes life great in that regard. A few opening remarks. We'll go through a couple items, and then I'll turn it over and really get the meat of the program. Dr. Iyer will be one of the lead speakers. We have one speaker who unfortunately had to leave because of a medical emergency and had to fly back to Peru, so we're kind of adapting time-wise. We have some other great speakers. I'm going to let Dr. Iyer introduce those with more specific details for that as we get through. But that's a couple of the folks. If you recognize them, please introduce yourself to them. Because I think it's a great opportunity for networking within both the students, the industry, and the different groups. Our team, which is what makes it happen, obviously, is Dr. Iyer. Heidi's walking around someplace. She's the one that really puts all the pieces together for this conference, and we want to thank her and appreciate her efforts. We have a case competition at 3 o'clock. We would love for anyone that has an interest in being a judge for the case competition to stay. Non-Purdue related individuals, it's got to be industry, and we'll be doing it in this room at 3 o'clock. It started, the way we do the case competition is we have a preliminary, and then, these are some of the folks that came in for the preliminary, and then we narrow that down to the next tier. So today we have these group of universities. The students are sitting around here. For the business folks that are here, the industry, they would love to meet with you and talk with you. They got the case yesterday. And so they've diligently been working all night, in some cases, to try to prepare for the case and the analysis that they're going to do. And again, that'll be at 3 o'clock. We want to thank our sponsors and those companies that we have affiliations with. Without that, we couldn't do what we try to do. It just would not work. So one of the things that's, before we go into session one of the things that we've tried to do over the years is we decided that we need to have a location, a venue where our corporate clients and our students can go and kind of get their hands dirty as it relates to new technology. We call it the Engagement Center. It's in the building right next door to us. And so during breaks, we're going to have you can go over there. We have 3D drones, or 3D printing, we have drones, HoloLens, Google Glass, a wealth of technology that is going to be applied to the future of manufacturing and impact the supply chain as well. So we would strongly encourage you to go over there, spend a few minutes. At the morning break, we're going to have 2 students standing out here, and they'll go over in groups to be able to make sure that you get over there and don't get lost. But it's room 162 next door for that component. And I think you'll learn something. I think it'll be fun. Within that case, then I'd like to introduce Dr. Iyer, who's my boss, so I need to be nice. No, he's my boss. He's also the department head in the School of Management, and he's presented a presentation for today. Later on in the day, we'll talk about what the center's doing in terms of highlights and the different types of activities.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, welcome. I hope all of you had a chance to get some coffee and scones, etc. The topic for today is ethical global supply chains. Steve mentioned a case competition. The case consists of 2 parts. I developed the case, so it had part A was what all 16 teams used as part of their submissions. And part B was what was distributed yesterday. So life was not that complicated. Yes, and I hope all the teams had fun with part B. The reason that we are focused on this topic is that we think that this is the logic of thinking about the ethical issues or the ethical dimension of supply chains has as a response a number of things that are important, that play a role. Some of it might be technology, some of it might be procedural, some of it might be some value systems that have to be implemented, et cetera. And all of that becomes even more difficult when you have many partners. All that you can do is to advise them, require of them, et cetera, but you really have to delegate responsibility for execution. So that makes for a very, very interesting context. So Steve mentioned my role here at Purdue. GSCMI, which is the Global Supply Chain Management Initiative, started back in 2005. It's run out of the same entity that there's a sister organization, a sister institute called the Dauch Center for the Management of Manufacturing Enterprises. So DCMME has its conference in the fall. This, by the way, is spring. Okay, and because here at Purdue, we think spring is something in the mind, so we think of spring as something impending, but for us, February is spring. So this is, what I wanted to do was to pull together a few things we discuss in class and use that as a starting point to set the stage for a number of things. And none of these will provide answers, by the way. The one thing that I think we try to tell our students is, you come to a university to learn to ask questions and figure out a way to generate the answers that make sense using first principles. So a lot of these would be some interesting questions, and we're going to count on the discussion today and the speakers to help us get some answers. So the question really is, what do we mean by an ethical supply chain? So basically, the word supply chain means we're going to think about an end-to-end view, and I'm going to add a couple of things in this list, including recycle and recycling and reuse. Not just the flow of the product as it makes its way through, but also the issue of what happens to the product when you're done. And that's important because some companies have gotten into trouble at that point, even though they've managed the rest of the supply chain. So what does ethical mean? Certain parts of ethical are no-brainers. When you hear no child labor, I say, of course, that's what I want. No slave labor. So this means anybody who works, by the way, the definition in Europe of a student intern from the United States who goes to Europe and works on an unpaid project at a company is classified as slave labor. Okay? So one of the things we have to do is we ever send a student intern to Europe, we have to have them register at a European university. Otherwise, they'd be classified as slave labor. But there is a definition, and this definition is sort of, there is a technical definition of what that means. It is people not having a choice and being forced to accept conditions. Now, the next step is basically acceptable work environment. When we think about the word having an ethical supply chain, so is there an acceptable work environment? Is there sufficient ventilation? Are there humane working conditions, fire exits, structural safety, ergonomics? All of that is considered part of having an ethical supply chain. Are people being paid a living wage? And is there compliance with local laws? Now, as this list increases, these are all things that would be great to have in every supply chain. But if you look at what when companies use the globe for all of their operations, very often there is a question is how much control and information do you have at every stage of your operation? What do you know about all the different steps? And that's really what makes it interesting. So let's sort of dig through this a little deeper. So this you can think of as a starting point. You always need a definition. So let's think of this definition of a supply chain and a few things. And what I'm going to try to do is to give you a few examples related to companies where some of these issues have crept up. And these are now cases in business schools, but they're also interesting things as a way to think about the future. So here's a supply chain. So think about an OEM, an original equipment manufacturer at the end, with tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Technically, that should be another tier 1. If you look at the usual definition, everybody in the first step is tier 1. But we're going to assume that the other tier 1 is doing a larger subassembly than this one. So imagine there are all these players, and the reason we have pulled them out of the OEM is that it's someone else. You have a contractual relationship with them. Their employees don't work for you. So the question here is, if something happens in the production of the product, who is responsible? Right? Is the OEM responsible for actions across all supply chain participants? Okay? So from the perspective of various non-government organizations, they say, absolutely, you're the OEM, it's your name on that product, your Tesla or your Apple or your Ford or whatever, you're responsible for everything that happened anywhere in the world that has shown up in your product. So here's my perspective, yes. And one perspective is because you own the brand. People wouldn't have bought this product without your name on it. You put your name on it, you're responsible for everything. Yes, because you chose the supply chain. Nobody asked you to choose this one. You could have picked a bunch of people down the road from you who you could monitor, but you decided against it. So it's your responsibility. Yes, because you're often the person who makes the largest margin. Okay? Now, these are possible reasons for yes. In all of these yeses, one of your answers might be no. I'm not responsible. I only paid the first person, they gave it to me, and I'm done. But in many cases, that's not been the issue. And I'll give you examples where the actual flaw or the failure is somewhere in the supply chain. But the person held responsible is the person with their name on the marquee, the person who owns the brand. So let's look at some examples. So of course, this is an example which is used in business schools a lot, and that is the Mattel lead paint example. And those of you who remember, November 2006, it actually started before the lead paint. So November 2006, Mattel recalls Polly Pocket. Some of you may remember Polly Pocket, some of you may not. Some of you may have played with it, if you're some of our students, for magnets that were a threat to children. But in July 2007, okay, a European retailer found high lead content in paint used in Mattel's toys. In August, Fisher-Price started recalling toys due to lead in paint. 18 million products recalled, another 848,000 toys recalled. Now, of course, this was a problem because kids, even though you tell them a gazillion times not to put the toys in their mouth and lick them, that's what they do. And so who's responsible? The company that sold the toy. Well, so what did Mattel do? Now, if you recall that story, what had happened is Mattel had subcontracted this task to a company in China. That subcontractor had subcontracted the paint delivery to another manufacturer. It's that manufacturer who had accepted the higher amount of lead in the paint. So Mattel was unaware as to who was selling the paint. They had just set some standards for the paint, and they assumed compliance with respect to the standard. What did Mattel do? The first thing Mattel did was to apologize to the Chinese customers and say, it wasn't your fault. It was our fault. We should have given you better directions, so we accept responsibility. They committed to certifying all paint suppliers and testing every location. They decided they'll control production processes, do inspections throughout the supply chain. They would test toys before they reach the customer. And so the interesting question that comes out of this is, in today's global supply chain, it's fragmented. There are many people playing a role. What should the OEM do? Should the OEM oversee production that's done anywhere in the world by anybody involved in the supply chain to ensure compliance and safety for their customers? Okay. Now, this is an important question, and many examples are pointing to the fact that OEMs do not have a choice. They do not have the option saying, well, I didn't know. Okay? And there are many countries who are saying, I didn't know is not an acceptable answer. You should know. When you hire someone and they do something for you, and what they do for you impacts your customers, it's your responsibility. So this is what happened with Mattel. Now, notice in Mattel's case, they basically said, we are the OEM whose name is on the marquee. We'll accept responsibility for everything. Anybody who did something, unless it's fraud or egregious, in this particular case, in the Mattel example, there was no fraud whatsoever. Whoever accepted it and followed the procedures of testing that were in place at the time, but it went through the system. And that's what Mattel did. The second example that you hear a lot, and this is now taught in business schools a lot, is there was a Rana Plaza in Bangladesh that collapsed. And when the buildings collapsed, one of the things that happened, of course, it killed 1,129 people. one of the things that the New York Times and everybody else did is everybody ran in and say, hey, who were they producing clothing for? And they saw Walmart. So they told Walmart, hey, why were you producing here? And the officials at Walmart said, we specifically banned this supplier from our supply base. They took them off the list. We gave the contract to someone else, and they recontracted it to the same people. So the people who were banned from bidding. So they said, OK, we will not bid, but we will get the contract from somebody who was awarded the bid. So they said, well, didn't you know if you awarded the bid to someone where they were doing their work? He said, how would we know? We awarded them the bid. It's their choice. Well, the general public opinion was, well, that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to say that, well, I awarded the bid and I walked away. You should know where it's being done, what the conditions are, et cetera. So what ended up happening? So they actually ended up, and this is something that's been the subject of a lot of academic papers, there actually were two solutions that emerged. There's a European solution, which is called, so the European and Canadian retailers got together and formed a consortium, and that was called the Accord. The US manufacturers, Walmart and retailers, Walmart, Target, et cetera, formed a different group called the Alliance. Now, you might say, well, why do I care? There actually is a big difference. So it turns out that the Accord decided to pay for damages, pay for worker compensation, literally pay directly. The Alliance decided to provide loans. Okay? Now, there's a big difference between the two. In one case, you basically say, I'm going to pay all the costs. The second, we say, we will pay the costs, but you have to make a business decision that you're going to comply with all of the rules in order to win the business. So the lawyers basically advised the US corporations that think of it as a business transaction. Don't walk in and say, I'm going to pay for everything. Okay? So the difference between the two was in the Accord, you were guaranteed business. We paid for all of this. We will contract with you, et cetera. In the Alliance, it was, these are the terms under which we'll do business with you. You have to make the decision to comply with it. And if you need money, we'll give you a low-interest loan. So this, by the way, has been a lot of point of contention. Which of these will survive, et cetera. But these are, even though in the normal case, if everything goes right, they look the same, in the details, they're a little different. And the difference is who is responsible. Under the Alliance, the supplier takes responsibility, takes the loan, and makes a business decision to comply in order to win the business. Under the Accord, they've just paid for everything because they decided that this is a better way to run the system. So there's a question as to whether who retains responsibility. So this is the Accord versus the Alliance. Now, there are other things that came with it: independent audit facilities, trade unions demanding higher minimum wages, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all the reality of thinking about how you ensure that products made all over the world comply. So the interesting question here is, so what's the option? So one solution was, don't source in Bangladesh. Okay? We're going to go somewhere else. Well, actually, it turns out that there aren't too many other options. Okay? And the reason is because one of the things that's changing in China dramatically is wages are going up. The population is aging. The forecast is in the year 2100, which is a few years away, the year 2100, China's population will be about 550 million. Its current population is close to 1.4 billion. And if you say, how did we go from 1.4 billion to 550 million? Well, China enacted the one-child policy. The population is aging dramatically, and there aren't enough people to replace it. So guess what is happening? China doesn't have the capacity to produce all these products that they were making. So they're rapidly going to get out of it. So a lot of clothing manufacturing, toy manufacturing, et cetera, is leaving China and moving to other places because the younger generation wants to work on different jobs. Where is it going to go? Which country has big ports, et cetera? Bangladesh is one, Burma is next, Vietnam, India, Cambodia. That's where everything is going. But remember, Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma are small countries compared to China. So you really don't have an option. So when you say, where am I going to source? You might say, well, I'm going to bring manufacturing back to the United States and pay 40% more. or I'm going to continue to have manufacturing in other parts of the world and find some way to manage the risk. So this is an interesting question. How do you manage the risk? In fact, a related question is, should companies be doing the job that countries should be doing? So if you look at approving licenses, shouldn't this be something that the country should be doing? So these become questions saying who's responsible. But from the point of view of the court of public opinion, it is you, the company, are responsible. A few other examples of how some of these things could be fairly complicated. So this is a Harvard Business Review case, and this is a case involving IKEA. So basically, IKEA got a phone call from a German documentary producer saying, okay, we have evidence of you, one of your suppliers in India, using child labor. And this is just, in a couple of hours, we're going to broadcast this documentary. Okay. And they told them the name of this company. It was called Rangan Imports. So of course, immediately, IKEA suspended this supplier. So they dropped the supply immediately, said, well, now we're clean. We don't have the supply anymore. What was interesting is that they did an analysis of the movie. And the movie producer hired child actors to play the role of carpet manufacturers, which had nothing to do with the supplier, and spliced in the tape of this supplier. So it took a year and a half to do this investigation, and they realized the supplier had absolutely no problem. This was a documentary film producer who needed a story. So now what they use is a third-party certifier who then goes to all the facilities and approves supply. Incidentally, IKEA came back, restored this supplier, paid them for all damages, did all of that in order to take care of this problem. So one of the related questions to think about is, remember, in statistics we talk about type 1, type 2 error. You can sometimes make a mistake because you rely on a documentary film producer or somebody or an accusation or an NGO. But it's always useful to do your own analysis, because otherwise you might be picking the wrong person. There is such a thing. So the question then becomes, how much monitoring of suppliers do you need to have so you have the confidence that the system is operating as planned? So this is just sort of a note of caution to think about. One of the things that is interesting that's happening now is with respect to Apple. So Apple and Foxconn, of course, some of you, if you've picked up the most recent Business Week, you'll be hearing about Foxconn in Wisconsin, right? But that's not the Foxconn we're talking about, even though, good luck, Wisconsin. So Foxconn, there was an article in the New York Times talking about how Foxconn, Apple's supplier in China, was treating its workers. So the story really, several years ago, was there was a last-minute change. Of course, those of you who remember the story, in the early days of the iPhone, legend has it that Steve Jobs, when he was alive, he took the latest version of the phone, put it in his pocket, went home along with his keys, and then when he picked up his phone, the surface of the phone was scratched by the keys. And he came back and said, this phone is not shipping. Okay, we need to have phone glass, the glass of the phone should be such that even if you put it with your keys, it will not scratch. So they replaced the glass, and they replaced with, of course, now there's Gorilla Glass and other glass that's there it's scratch resistant. But the interesting thing was there are a whole bunch of phones they were supposed to ship. So the New York Times story said that all the displays were shipped in at midnight, and they said, here is basically the description in the New York Times. It said a foreman roused 8,000 workers in the company's dorms. Each employee was given a biscuit and a cup of tea, guided to a workstation, within half an hour started a 12-hour shift fitting glass screens. Within 96 hours, they were producing 10,000 iPhones a day. Okay? So the story was, wow, such agility. And the public read it and says, wow, such inhumane treatment of people. Okay? Now, following that, there was an article which said that there were 18 workers who jumped out of the tops of the company's buildings and committed suicide. And there was a quote from the Foxconn executive saying, don't worry, now we have nets to catch them. Okay? So the general impression of that was, this is a totally inhumane company. That was the court of public opinion. And so Apple basically said, this is a big risk, because if you look at this company and think of it as inhumane, well, that won't do. So what has changed? A lot. So this is Apple now. Apple now does audits of every one of its suppliers. There's a list of all of its suppliers. If you go to the website, they list every supplier across the world involving in anything on your iPhone or iPad, any product. And if you click on that supplier, they've made public the audit of that supplier, what things they passed, what things they didn't pass, et cetera. And they said, if you find any problem with anything, let us know. We'll just put it up there. There's a code of conduct. In fact, there's also a very, we had a brief discussion regarding looking at materials. One of the issues with respect to electronics is the source of cobalt. Now, if you say, why cobalt? There's a problem with cobalt. A lot of cobalt is mined in the Congo, and there's a Conflict Materials Trade Act that requires companies to keep track of where things come from. So this is from Apple's website. I just downloaded 2 days ago. 100% mapping of everything from material sourcing, trading, refining, smelting. Everything you need to know about every ingredient in your phone is available online. And so the question is, why should Apple do this? And why should companies do this? And why is monitoring every step in the supply chain so important? Well, that's part of doing business now. And making everything public is part of doing business. Part of building the confidence of all the customers, saying, we're aware of who's supplying everything for us, we're keeping track of it, we're paying for surprise audits, and would make things public. So this is today's supply chain. This is sort of required. And one of the things to think about is that the people who are worrying about this, one of our faculty was a treasurer for a large Fortune 100 company. And if you look at the treasury in companies where people think about risk, well, right now it's no longer the supply chain manager. It's the CFO who's worried about this risk. Because guess what? When this becomes public, it has a material impact right away. And so you better be aware of it. So this is just part and parcel of doing business. One of the very interesting things, and I think if you get a chance, please take a look at this website. This is a guy called Ma Jun. And if you had asked me, and this is just my guess, if you had asked me, which country in the world would somebody take all the data regarding every effluent discharge, public document, et cetera, and make it public, you'd be hard-pressed to say it's China. And yet, that's the place where you can get more information about every company than any other place in the world. And if you get a chance, please go to this website. So this is an entity called IPE. This is an NGO. He won the Rockefeller Prize, for example. And what he has is something called the Blue Map. He collects every piece of information submitted by every company everywhere in China. And he has an enterprise online monitoring, and he has the details of what a company did to fix a problem with an effluent. So his logic is, we're going to record bad things that happen, and when you tell us that you've taken actions to fix it, we're going to include it in there, because our goal is not to shame somebody, but once that document is out there, we want to get things to improve. So here's sort of the logic that they use. And in his logic, which is sort of very interesting, there's a wonderful video on the internet if you type his name and you search. And he basically started off, when he was doing this, he was doing it by himself. He has one room, he was collecting all this information, and nobody paid attention. So he decided, here's what he was going to do. He was going to collect all the suppliers that IBM was using, and all the suppliers that Apple was using, and all the suppliers that HP was using. And he added up all the pollution they were creating. And he said, I'll just make it public. I'll just say, IBM, you created, excuse me, this much pollution in China. HP, you created this much pollution in China. That got the company's attention. And they said, well, we're going to do something about it. He said, just tell me what you're going to do to fix it, and I'll make it public. So it'll say, IBM has taken these actions to improve pollution control in China, et cetera. And so his logic is to use the transparency of monitoring in order to get companies to do the right thing, which is to put in the scrubbers, treat the effluents, do all of the steps to make things right. From my perspective, I've been telling our students in every class I teach, just start a company that does exactly that in the United States and in Europe and everywhere else, and you would have done a great service. I don't know. Nobody's taken me up on it. Somehow, we'll see. So one of the things that's interesting, there are many regulations that are driving compliance. The Conflict Materials Trade Act was included in the Dodd-Frank bill, and that requires companies, electronics companies, and it holds their CEO responsible for knowing where conflict materials come from. By the way, conflict materials is a US definition of a conflict. So the US identifies the good guys and the bad guys. And if you are sourcing from people who are the bad guys or being funded by this mining, then you've treated a conflict material. Conflict material shows up in diamonds. There's a notion of blood diamonds from Rwanda, et cetera. So, but this is important, and companies are spending quite a bit of time keeping track of it. Here is the rule associated with it. But you may not know that there's an equivalent, California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. And the Transparency in Supply Chains Act can get a lot of people in trouble. A few years ago, Costco was in trouble for buying fish from an Australian distributor who had sourced from an Indonesian trawler who had in the trawler people who were behaving who were living slave-like conditions. So guess who was responsible? Costco. So it was Costco's responsibility to ensure that the trawlers that the Indonesian fishermen were operating had people treated humanely and given sufficient time to live in humane conditions. This is the law. So if you're operating in California, this is required. So some of the things, the questions are, what can you do? I mean, what can you do to ensure that things are treated ethically? The first is monitoring. Virtually every company, if you look at Walmart or anybody else, there's an expectation that you will pay for random audits, et cetera, and you will have this information. So and those audits have to be random, surprise audits, et cetera. Otherwise, an audit really doesn't make sense. The second is transparency. The Apple example, share the information. Anybody who has any questions sees it. So if you're Greenpeace or anybody else and you stop a ship and you make it public, and they'll say, we'll put it on our website, we'll figure out a way to fix it. Responsibility. So here's where, I know we'll have several speakers talk about this. Here's where there's an expectation that the OEM will drive the agenda, will enable people to use a technology, will provide procedures that people can use to detect and be proactive. Now, some of these things are, they are vitally important, and the vitally important part is values, no compromises, no trade-offs. Okay? Now, some of these things are particularly important when you think about, recently, VW and all of those kinds of issues, and you basically think, how do these things happen? If you ever get a chance, there's a wonderful book called Moral Mazes, M-A-Z-E-S. And it's a book about challenges that engineers face when they're asked to do something that they realize makes no sense whatsoever, and it borders on the unethical. But the problem is somebody is pressurizing them so much they sign off on it. And the question is, that signing off is a values question. Okay? Certification of the supply base. Very often, you may have an opportunity to get a price reduction. You may have the opportunity to get a gold star because you drove down cost 10, 15%. But you didn't ask too many questions as to how the 10 to 15% savings came from. That's a problem. And some of the students will recognize that from the case. In many cases, one of the things that companies do is see to it that there's senior executive oversight. Now, we often hear from companies, oh, he's in charge of safety. And it almost seems like if you're in charge of safety, somebody just signed a death warrant. You're going to get ignored, you're in the basement, and nobody cares. Okay? Well, if you treat ethical issues the way you treat safety, then that's ground for a lot of trouble. And so the question really is, how will all these considerations affect the supply chain? So when we were picking a topic for today's conference, the reason that we were focused on managing ethical global supply chains is that if you see this list, then it touches many things. It touches how revenues will be generated for the firm, it touches how costs will be influenced, who gets to play a role. It also touches design, it touches compliance, it touches HR, a lot of activities. In other words, you can cut corners and make profits, but it catches up to you. And when it catches up to you, the cost associated with it is far more significant than any benefits you got. Just as a reference, part of my role as department head is we're in the hiring mode, and so we had a candidate in finance yesterday in my office, and I said, what do you work on? He said, I study bribes, corruption, et cetera, and what impact it has on firm share price. So we got to talking, what is a bribe, what is it? And one of the things he told me, which I was chatting to some people, in fact, this morning I was looking up the definition, he said that different countries chose different ways to describe unethical practices. So in the US environment, there is the notion of grease payment, which is legal, and bribes, which are illegal. So grease payments are payments you make to make things go faster, but do not involve a discretionary decision. Okay? And that's accepted practice. $20, this is faster, $100, this moves faster, et cetera. Supposedly, and there is a category which says facilitation payments, and you can list it as facilitation payments. Okay? The UK decided that facilitation payments are illegal. And the newest version of the UK Act is that if you have an office in the UK and any other office you have did something, then when the CEO lands in Heathrow, that person can be taken directly to jail. Okay? In other words, you're responsible for any unethical behavior in any branch, anywhere in the world, if you have a UK office. So of course, my interpretation is goodbye UK office. But they may do that with Brexit anyway. But the one thing to note is that I think what's particularly interesting is the interpretation of the ethical operation of the supply chain varies by location and varies by the interpretation of their laws. So one thing you can do is basically say, I'm going to just have zero tolerance, and here's how we're going to operate. And that would be ideal. I hope people do that. But it may be that individual players and individual locations will end up having flexibility to operate the way they operate in that location. In any case, the purpose of this conference is to flesh out some of these questions. We're going to have a large number of speakers who will provide their insights into the challenges associated with implementation. But I'm hoping that we use this opportunity to have a wonderful dialogue regarding, sorry, one second, I'm trying to get my notes for my next step. Yes, we have a wonderful dialogue regarding how ethical global supply chains will operate. And these include discussions all the way from how senior executives can play a role in having an impact, to the use of technology, to many other solutions. So with that, I'm going to stop my presentation, and I'm hoping we'll have time. But the way we're organized right now for this is that we'll have our next speaker. I'll introduce Shelley Austin in a few minutes. And then after 2 talks, we're going to have a question and answer session where we'll get a chance to get you to guys. So thank you.